I want to welcome you to intentional relationship building. I want to thank you so much for your participation, whether you're with us live or whether you're watching the recording, maybe on my website or on my YouTube channel. So I'm going to record this and you're welcome to watch or listen to it at any point in time. For those folks who are attending live, keep your mobile device close by. I'm going to use an online polling software to ask you questions, and you'll be able to answer them completely anonymously. But I want to kind of do some engaging back and forth dialogue there if we can. And then if you, like I said a second ago, if you have any comments or questions, don't be afraid to put them in chat. And Tiffany is welcome to stop me and interrupt what I'm talking about to make sure that we get your questions answered. And I want to start a quick, look at intentional relationship building with a great quote from Zig Ziglar. And the quote is, "I believe that you can get everything in life you want if you will just help enough other people get what they want." And I love the interconnectivity of relationships and how humans seem to have been designed for social connectedness and wanting to do things with each other and wanting to learn from one another. So thank you so much again for joining me today and thinking about how can we really have deep and meaningful relationships intentionally. So there's a couple-year-old picture of me there on the left, and on the right-hand side, you can see a couple of things that I do. For the last 10 years, as a career and executive coach, or even kind of a life coach in some ways, I've been able to guide leaders and organizations through really big challenges and transformation. And I think the way that I've been able to do that is creating really safe places for people to express themselves, to feel heard, to be vulnerable, take some risks, but really just be their most authentic self. And as you can see there from some of the things that I've got to do in terms of being a contributor or an author, what I want to do when I'm sharing information with the world about who I am is I want to make sure that my life's mission of unlocking human potential gets shared through all of that content and all of that material. And I really do value authenticity and growth and spirituality. So on my website, michaelsseaver.com, which many of you have already visited, there are many free downloads that you're welcome to download for yourself. There's 200 plus blogs and insights, lots of different media features. There's 20 plus videos on the homepage, and those also are on YouTube. And also at the end of today's conversation, I will just share a little bit about a book that I published recently and kind of a circle that we're starting as a result of the publishing of that book. And in the bottom right-hand corner, you can see a little bit that I'm a proud partner of Tiffany, who is also on this call today. She and I met a couple of years ago, been dating for about a year and a half. And she recently left her job and started to kind of support and work for me. And I think when we think about relationships in the coming years, some of the things that we're accustomed to, both partners working or one partner working, one staying at home, some of those lines are getting pretty blurry. And I'm really glad that Tiffany and I are helping to blur those lines and really do what's authentic for us. And I'm also stepdad to a wonderful 20-year-old named Aaliyah. Having them around me has been great because it really does help me to feel balance, helps me in my awakening, helps me really form and deepen relationships well. So what I want to talk about in the next 45 to 50 minutes is I'm going to share a couple of things about self-discovery, things that if I was you, that I would really be thinking about how we're showing up for relationships and maybe some of the things that are happening in society that we want to be mindful of. So I'm going to talk about 4 or 5 things with regards to things that we can go through individually alone around self-discovery. And I'm going to talk about the 3 phases of transformation and mention a couple other resources that I've shared before that you might have access to talk a little bit about, hey, here's what we need to do if we need to end and let go something, or if we're going to sit in a neutral zone and have some experiments, and then if we're going to move to a place of actually taking action. And after I talk about those kind of 3 phases of transformation and change, I'm going to share 8 relationship building habits that I've seen work or that I've read about or that I've had clients try. So you can use any of those that you feel are important. You can use all 8, you can use 1, you can use none, really up to you, but I just want to give you 8 different ideas to help you and kind of kick us off in that way. So as I mentioned just a second ago, I've been coaching for 10 years, but I have been leading teams for just over 25. And I've spent thousands and thousands of hours in the arena, as Brene Brown calls it. And I've had the pleasure of really getting to understand the patterns in the way that the human mind works, understanding what shapes somebody, why they communicate the way that they do, how do we help one another really show up for one another and for ourselves to be seen and to feel heard. But really at the core of all of those things is how do we do that in a way that deepens those relationships, right? Because it's the thing that really matters tremendously. So that's what we're going to do. We're going to talk a little bit about self-discovery. How do we navigate change? 8 habits that you can choose to deploy if you want. And then what are we going to do for implementation? So I'm going to pop up a Mentimeter polling question, but just think about this for a second. So the Mentimeter polling question is, so open up a browser, maybe on your phone, maybe on your computer. And if you don't want to answer the question, you don't have to. Remember, your answers are anonymous. But if you do happen to have your phone close by and you would like to answer the question, go to www.menti.com. And you can see the code in the upper kind of portion there of the screen. And Tiffany, if you want to, you're welcome to share it inside the chat if somebody wants to see it there too. And the code is 67117125. Now, let me explain what an ACE is before you answer the question. But because this is a really core part of how the human body functions and how we go through life. So after you've gotten logged into menti.com, entered the code, you should see this question on your screen. And the question is, how many ACEs did you have? And so ACE stands for Adverse Childhood Experience. Now, I want you to think back to those times in your childhood, maybe your teenage years, maybe your early 20s. And I want you to think about any type of possible abuse that you might have endured, any type of neglect that you might have felt, or any type of trauma that might have happened to you or a loved one. And I just want you to call into your memory any of those that you think that might be like an abuse, some sort of neglect, some sort of trauma. And if you don't mind, go ahead and respond to that and say, hey, I'm at 1, I'm at 2, I'm at 3, I'm at 4, I'm at 5, I'm at 6. And I'm going to share a resource with you later to help you understand what the questions are that help to assess whether or not we've had an adverse childhood experience. But for the time being, before I share that resource, I just want to make sure that we have a little bit of an understanding here. So when I think about ACE scores, looks like for the folks who are participating today, we've identified as having 1. There's one of us who probably has had 4 different moments or circumstances in their life. And then 3 of us were like, hey, I've had a little bit more than average. So it's important to recognize what it is that shapes us from a very young age in understanding how we perceive relationships. And the things that we can look back on as being a bit messy or a bit painful are a great place to start in understanding how we perceive ourselves and how we perceive those people around us. So keep your phones close by. I'll ask you a few more questions, but for the time being, just keep that image in your mind that half of us have had 1, 3, and 4. The other half of us have had probably more than 6 adverse childhood experiences. So you can see in the bottom left-hand corner there that basically since 1985 in San Diego, Kaiser Permanente has been doing a number of things around weight loss studies, but they've been tracking 17,000 people effectively since 1985, trying to understand various things around weight loss. And as they were going through and conducting their study, what they started to realize is that the study had nothing to do with weight loss whatsoever. It was actually about the effect on the body as a result of experiencing some sort of trauma. So from 1985 all the way through 1998, they were basically tracking and trying to understand the various connectivity points. And you can see in the lower left-hand corner that there are basically 10 types of childhood trauma that CDC and Kaiser Permanente have been tracking. Now, there have been more than 70 different publications from the late 1990s all the way through 2015. And what they were really trying to do is share the journeys of those 17,000 people. And so what they found was that as your ACE score, or the number of ACEs that you have, increases, your health risk is also going to increase as you go through life. I scored 5 out of 10 when I did the survey for myself. And again, I'll make sure that you have a link to it so that you can take it for yourself. But the truth is that what they found is that the vast majority of people have more than one experience throughout their life. So like 87 or 88% of people that responded said that they had more than one of the ACE score experiences. What they also found, and this is similar to Daniel Goleman and some of his research with emotional intelligence, is that coping mechanisms and how we deal with stress and trauma and neglect and abuse, it's passed from generation to generation. And so you can see in the center there are different types of physical, verbal, sexual abuse. There's physical or emotional neglect, trauma related to ourselves or family members, any number of things that it can be. But what it came down to was that there was an undeniable link between the childhood traumas we experienced, whether physical or emotional, and adult chronic disease and emotional instability as time passed. So what they found, right, and this is the link, is that they found that when we asked for help, when we were in trusting relationships, when we trusted our feelings and were guided by our feelings, or we thought a little bit more positively about some sort of a risk, we were able to mitigate the negative effects health-wise, right? So relationships were the things that helped to mitigate some stress. Now, a second thing with regards to self-discovery here is to look at Gallup's Q12. And if you've ever done an employee engagement survey with your employer, these 12 questions in some capacity have probably made their way into the survey. So Gallup, over all their years of data collection, they've studied over 100,000 teams and 2.7 million plus workers around the world. And they've been studying human performance for basically 75 years, trying to connect the dots. And as they've gone through and really understood that, is that when people were able to answer these 12 questions, and I'll send the slides to you all when we're done, so that you can ask and answer these questions for yourself, is that the people who were able to go down this list and answer these questions, if they ended up in the top quartile of all answers or performance, they saw an 81% drop in absenteeism, a 43% drop in employee turnover, a 64% drop in safety incidents. There was an 18% increase in team productivity. There was a 23% increase in team profitability, and there was a 66% increase in well-being. So when you look at these questions and you think about how many of these questions do you have inside your workforce, it is much more likely for you to be engaged or to receive some of those benefits. But what I want to point out is question number 4, someone's receiving recognition. Question number 5, someone cares about me as a person. Question number 6, someone at work encourages my growth and development. Or number 10, I have a best friend at work, right? Or number 11, I got to talk about my progress at work. So the reason why I call out these 12 questions is that the core of all of these things at work, at productivity, at profitability, at all the things that we know to be success inside corporate America, at the core is who we are in our relationships, right? Are we valued in our relationships? So just be mindful that the core of all success when it comes to corporate America rests basically on how well we respond to these 12 questions. Now, another thing with regards to self-discovery, number 3 of 5 that I'm going to share with you is Maslow's Hierarchy of Needs. I did a longer talk webinar a few months ago about this. It's on my website, on my YouTube channel, where I talk about finding generational similarities to improve communication. And I use this chart with some more description there. But what I want to call out here is that as we go through life, as we navigate life, we more or less are trying to move from someplace near the bottom of this pyramid towards the top. And so as we fulfill more or less one of the deficiencies, something that we might be lacking in our lives, we try to climb the ladder, if you will. And so every single human has this desire to continue to climb this ladder and to fill needs as we go. And so what I wanted to point out here is that based on various events and things that I talk about in that other webinar or recording, is that the generations that you can see on the left-hand side of the screen, they likely have started at different points on Maslow's hierarchy because of what was happening environmentally for them at that time. So if you happen to be a traditionalist born between 1900 and 1945, society was very, very different back in 1929, as an example, where the economy was only $1 trillion. But if you fast forward to somebody who's Generation Y or millennial, the economy in 2019, kind of at that point of early adulthood for those millennials, the economy was just about, I think it was $19 trillion. So really, really big changes in the way that society functions and the amount of money, the amount of safety, all of the things that exist. So when we think about being human, when we think about relationships, we all need the ability to grow. We all have a desire to grow. Now, what we want to be really mindful of is that we want to fulfill those first 4 levels of deficiency need. And then once we get to the point of the top 4 levels around growth needs, it's really our work to try to find a way to find, like as an example for the cognitive need, we want to make sure that we're finding meaning in our relationships. Or you can see that box that says self-actualization, right? How do we interact with others to learn experientially about them, but also about ourselves? Or if you're at that point of transcendence, how is it that you're taking all of your life's learnings and contribute to the community members around you to uplift and fulfill them? So as we think about our relationships, there are some core things across all humans that we want to be really mindful of. And we want to make sure that we're constantly assessing where we are on Maslow's hierarchy. But in dialogue and in conversations, how can we help others continue to navigate and transcend and ascend up this for themselves? And two more things that I'll mention about self-discovery. On the left-hand side, you can see something called the Harvard Study of Adult Development. And back in 1938, when Harvard used to just be called simply Harvard College, and at that particular time, it was a male-only school. So back then, Harvard decided to track for the remainder of their lives 268 sophomores back in 1938. And then as time passed, they realized that they wanted to expand their scope. So they added all of those sophomores' children. And then they decided to add a different control group of inner city Bostonians, right? Another 450 people, but they did that about 30 years later. So as they've been tracking them since 1938, what they realized is that at the relationships, or the depth and the quality of someone's relationship at age 50 was able to predict the person's quality of life at age 80. So we've been told by society that money, power, fame, intellectual quotient or IQ, social class, genetics, all of those things somehow predict success or happiness. And this is not true at all, right? So Harvard, through all of their years of study, have found that the quality of someone's relationships is what triggers a long, happy, and healthy life. So be really mindful of that as you're thinking about how do you deepen relationships or how do you build them. We should never try to do anything alone. We should always be trying to do things with people. So there's a great TED talk by Robert Waldinger about the Harvard Study of Adult Development if you desire to watch it. It's a really good one to watch. And the last thing about self-discovery, Google's Project Aristotle, you can see a small graphic on the right there. And what Google did is they tracked 180 of their project teams, and they were basically looking at team composition and team dynamics and attempting to understand why were some successful and why were some not. And so what they realized is that what was not important to a team's success was that the team did not have to be in the same location, right? So a team's success was not predicated on location. It was also not predicated on consensus decision-making. It was okay if one or two people made the choices and the rest of the folks didn't have necessarily a voice in that capacity. There was no correlation between someone's introversion or extroversion or seniority to the actual team being successful. But what they did find as being important, and you can see the top 5 on the right-hand side of the screen, is that people felt safe to express really divergent opinions from the rest of the group, or they felt that they could depend on, or they had reliable people around them to help fulfill not only their expectations, but also the expectations of the team, or they were really clear about their role and what it was that they were supposed to accomplish. So we just happen to be at this place in the world where there are so many little things that are evolving and changing. And we want to be really mindful of that. The core to our happiness, or the core to our success, is going to come down to self-knowledge, and it's going to come down to relationships. So relationships truly are critical for humans to, number 1, release and overcome trauma. Number 2, feel happy and engaged in the workplace. Number 3, meet the needs and uncover personal meaning for ourselves, but also to contribute to others. Number 4, to live a long, happy, and healthy life. And number 5, really to just be our authentic selves, sharing our vulnerabilities and taking risks. So I encourage each of you to go back to these slides, or maybe re-listen to this material, and to really think about these things for yourself, to say, where am I today, and how can I best show up for myself and for those folks around me? Okay, so I'm going to pop up another Mentimeter question. So grab your phones. And the second question is, and this is a free form response, so go ahead and key in whatever it is that you want. So what is your favorite relationship building habit, right? What is the thing that you love to do most in order to deepen or build a relationship? And you can submit multiple responses if you want. Tiffany, have there been any comments or questions that have come in so far?
Not yet.
Thank you.
You're welcome.
Okay, I'll give you another maybe 30 seconds or so to come up with the responses. But when you think about building your relationships, maybe with family, maybe a loved one, maybe a friend, what's your favorite habit, right? Whatever that is, whatever it is that you rely on to really make sure that you can deepen a meaningful relationship. And you can see from some of the responses coming in, we share our stories. Maybe it's getting coffee together, having dialogue, being really intentional about asking people what someone can do to help. You can see on the right-hand side, they're listening. It's great. In the center, socializing and trying to find a way to laugh together, which is great too. On the left-hand side, how do we learn about where someone is from, right? What are those things that we might have in common with them that isn't necessarily out there for everybody to know? On the left there, follow up with them about an action or something that's discussed. Great idea. And on the right-hand side, keeping in touch with friends and colleagues from previous periods in life. That is a brilliant strategy. I'll talk about that in a few minutes because that's a great one in many ways. So just wanted to get a little bit of a temperature check or a flavor from folks who are participating live. Say, like, what are the things that you've done to really deepen those relationships? So thank you so much for taking the time to respond to that. I'm gonna go back to my slides. So before I dive into the 8 habits, I just want to cover a couple of things with regards to transformation so that we can really absorb what it means to deepen relationships. So I talked about this in much more depth in on the homepage of my website or on my YouTube channel. I did a webinar called Processing Loss with Intention. And what it really was trying to help anybody to be able to really understand by looking at themselves or by looking at someone close to them. If a person is not expressing themselves verbally or is unable to share how it is that they're feeling, this webinar talks you through, and the download that is offered says, here is what you can do to recognize the actions that they're physically taking to understand which phase of transformation they are in. So if someone can't express themselves verbally, here are some things that you might be able to look out for to recognize where they're at, right? That might help you in the deepening of the relationship. And inside that PDF, I talk about where is their mind focused. I talk about questions that you can ask of yourself or of them. And I offer a bunch of ideas with regards to what can you do to influence them to find clarity to move from left to right on the chart or the scale. So what you see on the screen comes from William Bridges, and he has a book from years and years ago called Managing Transitions. So when you think about any type of transition inside of an organization, there's always the personal change that someone has to go through, but there's also the organizational, structural, procedural adjustments that happen, and that can come from, or there's great frameworks like GE's CAP model, or there's another one called Kotter's 8-step model. So there's a lot of ways that we can approach change, but personally, the 3 phases of transformation I found to be the most helpful with the people I serve. And if you look in the lower left-hand corner, you can see the very first phase is really about how do we end and let go of something, some habit, some belief, something. And so oftentimes a person is in shock, they're feeling uncertainty. So when we're in that phase of having to end or let go of something, they're in a place of extra heightened emotion. And that is A-okay. But their default oftentimes is to blame others for things that are occurring around them or possibly to them. And so be really mindful of maybe asking yourself or asking someone else near you, what is it that I fear, right? What is it that I'm actually losing in this circumstance? Or who is it that's going to support me, right? We want to be able to take that person who's in that process of ending and letting go or feeling those really high emotions. We want to take them out of that place of blaming someone else. We really want them to get back into themselves and understand where do the emotions and feelings come from that are guiding them to feel the way that they do. So after they've gone through this process of ending and letting go of past habits and rituals, possibly people, possibly jobs, possibly whatever it is needs to be left behind, right? Now we're in this place of having to stop old routines and old habits. And oftentimes you're going to try to find them, trying to save something that was before, but that's likely not going to be their best foot forward. We want to get them to think much more expansively and move into the second box, which is this emotional neutral zone. And in this phase, right, of transformation, the person's probably having a little bit of an identity crisis, right? But they're meant to be there because they're meant to be experimenting, and they're meant to be testing and trying things for what it is that works for them. So when someone's in this phase, you're going to notice that they're a little bit more self-focused, and they're going to be asking a lot more questions about what new habits or new routines or new rituals should I try? Or what in my life should I adjust or change? Or who or what should I be communicating to some of those people around, right? They're in this place of an identity crisis. They're possibly feeling a little bit of confusion, possibly ambiguity. Maybe they're dropping a little bit of morale or productivity. Maybe they're feeling resentment towards change, right? All of those things are possible. But this is a great place for a person to start to create something totally new. So after we found a way to go from ending and letting go and having all of those emotions of, fear and loss and emotional release, Now we're in this place of being in a neutral zone where we can experiment and uncover our brand and think about our identity, or think about various ways that we can start to share our brand with people. So once we get to that point of being on the far right in new beginnings, right, this is a place where solutions, really, really good solutions that are heavily aligned with your life's mission or what the organization is trying to accomplish, it's where they start to pop up, right? We can be at that point of solutions. We can start to take action. Now we start to feel like we're part of a team. They can start to see that they're making progress, or they're going to start to show more gratitude for the people around them, or they're going to start to think about who can they take with them on their journey. So be really mindful when you're thinking about yourself or thinking about those people close to you, is that when we're building relationships with people, we have to be aware of what phase of transformation are they in, because it's going to require a different response from us to make sure that we're showing up authentically to help them end and let go, or we can be in that neutral zone with them to help them think creatively about some possibility. Or we can start to move to action in the new beginnings place, right? What are the right opportunities? How can we help them feel enthusiastic about possibility? How can we remain open to different types of learning and action? So it's important that when we're trying something new, right, maybe one of these 8 relationship building habits that we'll talk about, we have to recognize where we are, where others are, and we have to honor their emotions and their process through it, right? So that's a good sign, or a deep sign of emotional intelligence, is to be able to recognize ourselves, but also recognize where someone else is in their journey. Okay, so let's talk about the 8 habits of intentional relationship building. So the first habit, and many of you probably have already done this, but I think that the first habit, and these aren't really in any particular order, I just wanted to get these 8 out, but this was the first one that came to mind for me. And when we think about knowing our own behavioral profile, maybe you've done the DISC, maybe you've done the predictive index, maybe you've done Myers-Briggs, the Emergenetics, Enneagram, 4 colors. There's any number of personality inventories and assessments that exist on the marketplace. If you haven't done one, I would really encourage you to do so. It offers a lot in understanding your own introvert versus extrovert style, people versus task orientation style. How is it that you handle negotiation or conflict? What are your default fears? How is it that you're going to respond under stress, right? What's your default body language? Because each DISRC style has a default body language, and you can learn to read that on people. And they even talk about strengths, right? The things that you bring best to relationships or to companies. So what you see on the right-hand side is a chart that I quickly put together during a mediation that I had to lead between a managing principal of an accounting firm and one of the senior managers, if you will. And so the managing principal was the person on the left, and the senior manager was the person on the right. And they were really struggling to communicate. It was the middle of tax season, and there was a lot of things that were happening that they were losing productivity really quickly. And so I was asked to lead a mediation between the two of them, and we went through what you see on the screen on the right to help them have a better awareness of themselves, but also of the other person. So what I did was, and this is something that you could possibly do to really get to a point of understanding, is that I went through and I described each DISRC style, not only for the managing principal, but also for the senior manager. And then I had each of them offer examples personally about what it meant to be that communication style or preference, like how they lived their life as a result of being that style. So after we came to some sort of understanding or agreement about communication preferences, we went down to the motivators section. So I explained the 8 motivators that you see on the screen to them to help them understand just a basic understanding of what the definitions were, how those things might show up in their life. And then I had both go back and forth and help them understand, share with the other person what it meant to have that motivator or how that manifested in their life so they could see specific examples. Then we did the same thing with the core values at the very bottom. We got to see why they valued what they valued and how that manifested in their life. So what was really important is that what they didn't know before, right? They just were in a place of frustration. The communication was pretty poor. They weren't able to get a whole lot of done. There were lots of mistakes and errors occurring in tax returns and things like that. We were able to move them to a place during this tax season, right? That's basically almost done here in the next couple of weeks. They have both messaged me privately and separately and said that things have been remarkably smooth because they now understood themselves and they were able to see the other person in a much different, more clear light. So if you want to build a really good relationship, right, the best relationships, they're oftentimes built upon knowing ourselves, but also being able to see these communication or motivator or core value preferences and patterns in other people. So habit number one, know your style, be able to look for some of those patterns and things from other people close to you. Now, habit number two is really about sharing our story, right? And as you've seen from society's kind of move, we're going through this really strong period of decentralization. And so this, you can look at this from the Edelman Trust Barometer. You can look at this from things that you're just seeing on the news. There's a lot of people that are paying way more attention to their family, to their loved ones, to their friends, to their own time, to their own health, than they are to sports or to some sort of television show or going to a movie, right? There's this really big shift that's occurring right now. So in a decentralized world where we have access to 8 billion people around the world, we can meet any one of those 8 people almost instantaneously. And we never really truly know who is following us. We never really truly know the impact that we're going to have on them. So I'm a big fan of being able to be willing to share a bit of your story first and lead by example, because what it does is it attracts really serendipitous opportunities and or relationships to you. So that can manifest in any number of ways for you. If you're an introvert and you like to write and you like to be a little bit more shy or quieter behind the scenes, then maybe it's to write an article or a blog or a book or set a social post or do something where it's you quietly sitting alone and being able to share your story and your message in your way. Or if you happen to be a little bit more action oriented and extroverted, maybe it's you like to perform in a band, or maybe you want to be the lead in some sort of theatrical performance, or maybe it's some other way to share your art, or maybe you really like team sports, right? Whatever those things are, make sure that it's really authentic to you, but make sure that you share. And as we're going through that, choosing the appropriate channel and really sharing in a way that's important to you, it matters. So I think that as we move from what astrologists call the age of Pisces into the age of Aquarius, a lot of these hierarchical structures that we become really accustomed to, they're going to take a little bit of a back seat to more of a grassroots uprising, if you will. And so we're going to see a reconnection to more decentralized, more local, smaller group discussion, if you will. So I think we're going to spend a little bit less time paying attention to athletes and celebrities and politicians, and we're going to spend more time paying attention to our own intuition and inner voice, but also to those people that are close to us, because there's so much knowledge and expertise that they have. Why not share your story, right, to be able to start that wheel kind of turning? And you can see a little picture on the right-hand side. That was me a couple years ago recording an introduction and an outro for an online course. And, you know, I'm at this place in my life that I feel really great and safe to be able to share life's highs and lows. Now, oftentimes in society, we're taught we should only be sharing our highs or our wins or our accomplishments. But I just want to encourage you that when you're sharing your story, don't just share the highs, also share some of the challenges and the lows that you've had, because the most meaningful relationships, they're going to occur when we share first. And then as they feel called to, others who have the courage will then, their energy, right, there'll be some sort of connection and they're going to come into your life at the right time. So maybe you want to share via social, maybe you want to share via your own website, maybe you're going to share via group, you know, pick whatever it is that works for you. Like I have a website, I do a lot of different messaging via my website, and that's my channel, right? That's my way. And there is no right or wrong way. So choose the channel that means the most to you, but it helps you to best express yourself in a meaningful way. Now, the third habit is this idea of leading with vulnerability. Now, relatively akin to the second habit, but this is something I think is pretty darn important, because Brené Brown said that vulnerability is not winning or losing. It's having the courage to show up and be seen when we have no control over the outcome. Now, that can be quite scary, right? Is that we're going to put ourselves out there and we don't necessarily know what's going to come back. Maybe one of our fears is going to be confronted. We genuinely don't know. But when we enter the arena like that and we have the courage to show up, more likely than not, there's going to be really great new people who are going to come into your life. So as you feel called to and as you feel safe to do so, one of the best ways to build relationships is to openly share any emotion, any feeling, any belief that you have, possibly like we talked about a little bit ago, maybe some hardships, maybe challenges, maybe trauma. If you've read the opening chapter of my book, you know an awful lot about one of my challenges or my traumas that existed just a couple years ago. And I don't mind sharing that with people because I want to serve as a little bit of light or a bit of hope in a place that seems relatively dark. Or if you feel called to, maybe it's some of the lessons that you learned, maybe it's your processes, maybe it's resources that you like to share. There's any number of things that you can share, from your feelings, emotions, beliefs, to hardships and challenges and trauma, to lessons you've learned, to processes, to resources, to your expertise. But I just want you to share that openly and honestly. Now, if you've ever read Influence by Robert Cialdini, which he published, I think, in the late 1990s, he has 6 laws of influence. And the very first law is something called the law of reciprocity. And what it states is that when we're attempting to influence or persuade someone, that humans are hardwired to return favors and basically pay back debts. So we will always treat others the same way that we've been treated. So what I want you to recognize is that when we lead with vulnerability in some sort of dialogue or conversation, whether personal or professional, the likelihood is that when you offer something of yourself, the person that you're talking with at some point soon, whether in that dialogue or the next dialogue, is going to then say something too, right? Something that's vulnerable. And then if that happens, right, if you start down that path with that person, you know that you're on the path to a deep and meaningful relationship. And in my book, I talk about this as being an upward spiral. And what I mean by that is that as we release small truths about our journey or ourselves, the universe basically expands up the spiral. And now we're going to have this chance to share a more expansive or a deeper truth or vulnerability about ourselves. And then we're going to be going up a spiral that allows for more expansion and more to be shared. And I think that what we found is that these deep and meaningful relationships are going to come from honoring our own highs and lows, but also honoring the highs and lows of the people around us. We're all going to have ups and downs. We're all going to have those twists and turns. How is it that we can start the process or start a good, meaningful relationship by leading with a little bit of vulnerability and starting that path of walking up the upward spiral in a way that really gets us to a point of honoring ourselves, but also honoring someone else? Okay, so I'll give you one more habit, and then we'll do another Mentimeter question. So habit number 4 is really about asking thoughtful questions. And so this came to me years and years ago when I started coaching. I read a book called Coactive Coaching by Laura Whitworth, and it was the thing that really helped to launch my coaching career in the early part of 2011. And it's important to recognize that when we think about coaches and we think about consultants and we think about therapists or we think about mentors, right, they're all different. And so what I want you to do is when you think about building a relationship, of course, you can be a mentor and find ways to be able to share parts of your journey that can help uplift somebody. But when it comes to deep, meaningful relationships, you're probably not necessarily going to be a consultant, right, who's in the business of being paid for some sort of process. And you're probably not always going to be a therapist or a counselor, right, who is there to be able to walk somebody to some version of their past and help them release some sort of trauma or some sort of an event from their past. I want you to put on your coaching hat, right, to develop those deep and meaningful relationships. So a coach is a person who asks the right how, what, and why questions in the moment, on the spot, and believes that the person they're talking to has the answers inside themselves. Right? It's not our job as a friend or as a lover or as a colleague to always provide the answer. It's our job, if you will, to build a deep and meaningful relationship by asking the right questions. Now, you can see on the screen that I put there a couple of different phrases with regards to, humans really do enjoy talking about their life's experiences, right? The brain is hardwired for story. So by asking the right questions, we can always get to a place of hearing someone else's stories. But if they're leaving details out, don't be afraid to ask deeper how, what, and why questions about what occurred, maybe who was involved, how the person felt, why things occurred the way that they did. And our goal really is to uncover those really more specific details, because those details become really important later down the process, because we want to be able to use them in follow-up emails or follow-up conversations or text messages, whatever those things are. We want to be able to use those details to remind them of our dialogue, but also to find a way to deepen the relationship intentionally. Now, I don't see this happen a lot, but I think it's going to start to happen more, is this idea of validating or paraphrasing what you heard. So it really does make people feel seen or heard or accepted when you can ask them deep and meaningful questions about their story, but you can also validate back to them what it is that you heard them say. So don't be afraid to, after someone has given a response, to repeat back in your own language what it is that you heard that person say, and they can say, yeah, that's what I meant, or maybe I would tweak it a little bit. We want to make sure that we make them really do feel seen and heard in that way. So it's important that when we think about being a coach, we think about asking these questions and we want to intentionally deepen a relationship, is that we have to honor and acknowledge that we know that the other person has the answers inside themselves. And oftentimes our work as a good relationship builder is just to pull those answers out of the person by asking the right questions. So trust the person to know that they have the answers inside of them. Ask the right questions if you can in the moment to try to get to that point, but just be mindful of that, right? And if you need to, and if you want to be able to build trust a little bit more or share a little bit more about your journey, don't be afraid to display your own knowledge or tell your own stories or share your own expertise by asking questions that are in alignment with something that you already know. So the fourth habit for me about asking thoughtful questions, I think it's probably one of the more important ones. I've done surveys and research around this topic specifically, but also of my clients. And this is the thing that oftentimes come back the most, is that people like me get to ask others questions that not a lot of other people ask. So if we're in the business of asking deep and meaningful questions, we are going to stand out from a lot of people around us. Okay, so I'm going to ask you to grab your phone. Let's do another Mentimeter question. And this question is, and again, remember, your responses are anonymous, but I want you to share something uncommon about yourself that few people will know. So you can enter multiple responses if you want, but what's something uncommon about yourself that few people know? And while you're thinking about that or answering or not answering, if you don't want to, that's okay. So somebody says, you know, I speak a little bit Swedish, which is great. My Mandarin Chinese is not the greatest anymore, but I speak a little bit of Mandarin, so I appreciate that. Someone suggested that he or she is an immigrant, which is awesome, right? We need diversity of thought, diversity of perspective, diversity of experience. On the right, a voracious science fiction fan. Love that, right? Love to be able to learn things in a very different way. So if you don't know me, I'm a relatively avid golfer now. I took about 2008 to 2018 off. Didn't really play a whole lot, but I've been able to play quite a bit in the last year, thankfully. And back in 1998, I got a hole in one. And obviously holes in one are pretty rare, but I was very blessed back in 1998 to be able to get that. And then also I'll share another uncommon thing about me is that my parents have a landscaping company in Michigan. And when I was a kid from age 12 until 24, I cut a lot of grass and shoveled a lot of dirt, but I was also able to operate big tractors and backhoes and graders and things like that. And so not many people know that I can also run that type of equipment. So even though my job today is coaching, I used to be able to do a lot of stuff outside with building landscapes and things around houses. So thank you guys so much for responding to this particular question. And so somebody loves punk rock music, love to be able to read books from a library. So I think finding those things that are a little bit uncommon that we might have in common is a really fun way to build relationships. So I'm going to talk about that in the next habit, number 6. So habit number 5, when we're thinking about building those relationships, is listening actively. So think back to the 7 Habits of Highly Effective People by Stephen R. Covey. And he talks at the very beginning of the book about the difference between a personality ethic and a character ethic. And I'm going to equate that to levels 1, 2, and 3 that you can see on the right-hand side of your screen. So according to Covey, a personality ethic is the skills and practices that affect your public image, attitude, or behaviors, right? It's basically like a false image of who you are. But a character ethic is really the content of your core values, or living by the gold or the platinum rule, really these kind of core principles of what it means to be human. So when we think about listening actively and how important it is in developing relationships, we really want to move from level 1 down to level 3. So level 1 is very much about almost like the personality ethic, right? We're at this place. We really are only listening so we know how to respond out of a place of self-interest. So we're listening internally, we're hearing our own inner voice, and we're trying to figure out a way what we need to respond with to protect ourselves, right? That's not great at building relationship. But at level 2, we're getting a little bit better, right? We're beginning to recognize the other person's tone of voice, their word choice, their body language. We're starting to quiet our own judging thoughts and move to a place of much more focused listening. Now we're really intent on the other person. It's a little bit harder, it requires some motivation, right? We have to be at a place of good self-awareness to recognize that we're at level 2, and that's great. Now, level 3 is where we ideally want to be to make sure we're great at listening. And so this to me is really akin to the character ethic, because what a person at level 3 is doing with this listening to understand is that they're combining the words the person's choosing, the tone of voice, their body language, the environment that they're in, previous interactions, memories that maybe they've made together. And they're able to connect all of those dots in the moment on the spot. And that is really understanding what it is that's happening, right? We're able to incorporate all of these things together to know how to show up for that person, not for our own self-interest, but to show up for them in a way that best uplifts them. So in really good mutually beneficial relationships, we listen at a really deep level and we make them feel valued or valuable. Okay. So just like I asked you in the Mentimeter question a second ago, think about some uncommon commonalities. And you can see a series of pictures on the screen there that I've taken recently of myself. And what I want you to understand about uncommon commonalities is that as psychologists review this more and understand this more, what they found is that when two strangers meet for the first time and recognize that they have something that's uncommon, but it's in common for them, that there is an instant ethereal connection that science really can't explain. Right? There's an instant subconscious feeling of belonging to the other person or to a group. So we want to invoke that in the relationship building process. So in habit number 2, I talked about how do you share your story, right? What do you do to put information out about yourself to help others find those commonalities with you and give them a chance to come to you serendipitously. And in habit number 4, I talked about the questions, those how, what, and why questions that you might ask to help search for those commonalities and pull them out of the person, right? So there's things that you can do to offer the uncommon commonality, or things that you can do to ask the other person to find what those commonalities might be. And you can see from the various pictures, right, it can be anything from places that you visited. Tiffany and I, you can see in the lower left-hand corner, we were just in Belize a couple weeks ago, and here's a picture from the dock looking back at one of the bungalows that is in Belize where we were staying. Maybe it's your core values, and you can see the peak values card deck. In the kind of upper right there, you can see the lion's head. That was a piece of art that was done for me a couple years back. But maybe you have some sort of favorite animal, some sort of spirit animal, something that's really interesting and meaningful to you. Maybe that could be an uncommon commonality. I mentioned my stepdaughter Aaliyah in the very first couple of slides, and you can see a picture of her and I a couple years back getting matching tattoos. Right after she graduated high school. And so on the inside of our right biceps, we both have a tattoo that symbolizes something really important to us. And you can see in the lower right-hand corner, if you have a pet, right, that's Cleopatra after the first order of my book came in the mail. And then there's also a picture of me. It's probably a 3 or 4-year-old there in the kind of the bottom center. So as I'm talking about all of these things and saying, hey, if you can find uncommon commonalities with places you've lived, places you've traveled to, maybe it's your core values or personal mission or belief pattern, maybe it's a relationship or a family experience, maybe it's the pets you've had, maybe it's a favorite book that we just talked about a second ago, or different languages, or being an immigrant, not an immigrant, right? There's all these different things that we can come together on and find common. So the great way to be able to develop and build a relationship is to not only share things about ourselves authentically, but also to ask questions and help to uncover those uncommon commonalities, because there's almost an instant bond that is formed. So we want to make sure that we build those really great relationships on the foundation of commonality. Now, habit number 7, I see we got about 10 minutes left in our time together. So the 7th habit that I want you to be mindful of is journaling, right? So whether it's tracking key details about someone else's life. And so in the early 1990s, British anthropologist Robin Dunbar was doing a bunch of research and understanding what is it that the human soul or mind can really integrate into its experience. And so what she found was that one person can comfortably maintain 150, so 150 stable relationships. But that's it. Any more than that, the human brain maxes out and can't maintain those relationships. So we can comfortably remember, know details about, and know the interconnectivity of that person to other people, but only up to 150 people. But it just so happens that with the advent of technology and the internet and now things like social media, we are easily introduced to thousands of new relationships each week, each month. And so we have to be really mindful of that. We're kind of going against kind of traditional evolution when it comes to understanding what the human body or mind can actually do. So what I'm advocating here is that when you're thinking about journaling key details for yourself, it's like almost treat it like you're going to design a personal CRM. And so whether you use LinkedIn, and there's other portals like there's one called Circles, there's another one called Monica, there's one called Contactually, there's another called Airtable. I do not use any of those personal CRMs, but I would encourage you to explore them. I just use a really basic spreadsheet. So I'm an introvert, really task oriented. And so I just use basic spreadsheets that I can search later because, both the Microsoft and the Apple spreadsheets are both really great with searchable functionality. But what's really important is that whether you're using a CRM or you're using a spreadsheet, we want to make sure not only are we tracking really basic things like the person's name, their social media accounts, email, telephone numbers, maybe addresses, maybe when's the last time you've had contact or when's the next time you're going to follow up with them. But we always want to make sure that we're tracking really important things about that person and or his or her life. What are some really important personal, professional dates they have coming up, like birthdays or anniversaries or promotions? What are they involved in right now? Are they participating in an Ironman or similar? Are there specific goals they're trying to accomplish that you can support and follow up with them? Are there particular things that they're working through that you can offer some resources on? So I would encourage you, whether you use a personal CRM or you use a spreadsheet, is to find ways to be able to track these things so that you know when to follow up with a person later and that you can mention these key details. Because very few people do a good job of remembering these details. And so be unique and be different and remembering those details and bringing them up each time that you talk with them. And the last habit, number 8, that I'm going to reference here is this idea of consistency. Back in habit number 3, I talked a little bit about Robert Cialdini in his book Influence. Well, the second law that he talks about in Influence is something called the law of commitment or the law of consistency. And really is that what Cialdini discovered was that humans have a really deep need to be or to be seen as consistent. And so if we are consistent or we consistently show up in another person's life, we're going to be fulfilling a deep need for both ourselves and for the other person. We also see this in emotional intelligence reviews from Daniel Goleman to Travis Bradberry. One of the 5 major components of emotional intelligence is social regulation, which is the fancy phrase, but what it really means is how do we influence the emotional clarity of other people around us in managing the relationship and building that network. And so people who are great at relationship building are really effectively great at setting up reminders to follow up with people about really important things that are happening in that person's life. So how do we show up for another person over really extended periods of time through a variety of life's highs and lows? So maybe it's connecting or following somebody on social media. Maybe it's an email or a thank you card after some sort of really in-depth conversation. Maybe it's 3, 4, 5 weeks later, connecting with that person on a different channel just to say hi. Maybe it is using a personal CRM or a spreadsheet to mark your calendar for some of those really important follow-up dates to check in with somebody. But I think the key is the very far right idea, which is how do we, through email, through phone, through text, how do we stay really connected to a person every 30 to 60 days? Right? So who are those 150 people that you can genuinely stay in touch with or that are important for you right now? And how do you stay close to them, right? It matters. So I'm going to ask you one final Mentimeter question right before I let you go, but I want you to think about those 8 habits that I just referenced. And so which of those habits, and you can choose, I think just one, maybe 2, but which habit do you think you want to try to deploy first, right? Is it to know your behavioral profile a little bit more? Is it you're going to share your story? Maybe you're going to start sharing more vulnerably about who you are. Maybe you're going to become great at those how, what, and why questions. Maybe you want to listen at level 3. Maybe it's finding those uncommon commonalities or being more consistent. So no right or wrong answer. Just wanted to see which of those 8 made the most sense to you and that you would probably dive into. Any comments or questions, Tiffany?
No questions.
Thank you. Okay, so for those folks participating live, maybe we're going to share our story a bit more. Maybe we're going to journal or track or do a CRM of some key details of those people around us. Maybe it's to deploy the law of consistency and just make sure that we're really reaching out to those key relationships. And a couple of us said, hey, let's listen actively. Let's be at level 3 much more consistently. So thank you for taking the time to respond to that. So I'm just going to mention a couple of small things about my book. If you've happened to already read my recently released book, thank you. It is available in ebook, audiobook, and print through, I think, 40 some odd thousand retailers across the world. But it really is, and you can see on the screen the 3 sections of the book and then the 3 chapters underneath each section. And so it really is meant to be a how-to guide, really for every person at every level inside of an organization to how to move them through the 3 phases of transformation and these kind of 9 processes, right? So dilemma, discovery, decision are kind of these 3 phases. And then we've got these 9 processes. And so each chapter is a story about myself or about a client, some research to support the chapter thesis, and then probably a 5 or 6 step process to make sure that you're processing loss or overcoming fear or releasing emotionally well. Or if you feel great in those places and you're already at this point of wanting to share your brand or lead an engaged team or figure out how to coach yourself and others, the latter part of the book addresses that with more depth. But the kind of core of this entire book is really about how do we empower anybody who's reading or listening to transition from believing that life's answers come from outside themselves to knowing that they're already inside themselves and that we can get there. So just want to be able to throw that out there. You can learn about it on my website as well. But I've been receiving really strong feedback about it. And then actually next Friday, the 30th, in partnership with Financial Executives International, or at least one of the chapters of FEI, we're actually launching what's called the You and I Know Circle. And so we're going to be doing basically like a part CFO roundtable, part like reading group, and then part executive coaching for about 4 months to make sure that people are navigating and going through change as much as they possibly can. So in the last hour, right, it's almost top of the hour already, we got to learn a little bit about self-discovery, right? That relationships truly are critical for humans to release and overcome trauma. If they have the right relationships, they're going to feel happy and engaged at work. Relationships really do help us meet the needs and uncover personal meaning and really to find a way to contribute to others. As per Robert Waldinger, right, in the TED Talk that I referenced around the Harvard study of adult development, relationships really are the key to a long, happy, and healthy life. And with Brene Brown and her insights specifically, right, relationships really do help us show up authentically and to share our vulnerabilities and to take risks. So in the 8 habits, right, we talked a little bit about how do we know ourselves, how do we share more openly, how do we honor ours and others' ups and downs, how do we uplift through those really insightful questions, how do we get to that point of listening at level 3, what do we got to do to find those uncommon commonalities, right? How can we track those key details about someone in our life, or how do we show up consistently for ourselves and for others? So I just want you to be thinking about your plan for all of this and to say, how is it that you're going to go about doing any type of implementation for yourself? And as you think about whatever that plan might be, it would be really to pick one of those 8 habits that you want to try and just try one of them for a couple of weeks and just see how it goes, navigate it, see how it feels, try it for yourself. And then as those couple of weeks pass and it feels better, then in the second couple of weeks, then layer in a different one. So don't try to do too much at once, just try to do a little bit each couple of weeks. And that'll be the thing that gets you to the place of really building those intentional relationships.